Hi there. Just want to spend a few minutes talking to you about threats, which we've already covered mostly, but more importantly, talking about incident response plans and how organizations can plan for and follow a specific framework when an incident does occur. So when we talk about a threat model specifically, we've kind of talked about what threats are, intentions and attack methods to intention to harm, and you can see a couple other definitions here as well. Um, and so some of this I'm going to kind of pop over because we've discussed it already in previous lessons. But what's important in terms of building a threat model and incident response plan is understanding the motivations behind what we're going to refer to as agents. Right? And I'll get into that just a little bit in more detail. Which assets might be affected, and then the actions that are going to be taken against that asset. So in a threat model, you can see where actions, agents, and assets are all interacting, where the action being whatever that, whether they're injecting a virus, whether it's social engineering, whether it is a denial of service attack, or sniffing network data, against what asset, whether that's physical or digital, and then the agent that's involved. And we use the term agent because that may be someone from the outside. It may be someone that is internal. Might not be malicious intent, but it could be an employee, or it could be a partner, right? So a business partner, a vendor, a contractor, something of that nature. So when we think about a threat agent, again, we're going to classify those as either external, internal, or partners. And if we take a look at where these are coming from which group, we can see that there's relatively little risk with regard to partners. In fact, it's been on the decrease. That's probably been because there are more controls and policies in place whenever contractors show up on site, or vendors, et cetera. Access is very restricted for that group of folks. You can see that internal agents are also dropping, mostly as a result of, again, better access controls in place, but also better education. Your biggest group of internal agents are your employees. And you can see that external agents are increasing over time, simply because of those on the outside seeking profit motivation, right? So your external agents are certainly those who are hackers, activist groups, people trying to profit. They could be auditors. Their act of doing an external audit may actually compromise your systems. They could be competitors, could be customers, right? Knowingly or unknowingly. Nature, meaning fires, floods, tornadoes, COVID-19, you name it. Former employees, if their access wasn't shut off properly. The government could be considered an external agent, and then clearly cybercrime. When we think about internal agents, again, these are mostly folks that work inside the organization that are internal, help desk, upper management, HR, could be even janitorial staff, right? We talk about people leaving items out on their desk that are easily seen by janitorial staff. And these aren't even technical or at all. It's just a piece of paper laying around with confidential information. And they can also be your IT folks. Internal auditors can cause damage just trying to check boxes for compliance sake. So that could be a weak spot. Also, upper management, if they're not properly educated on InfoSec categories. They're often the weakest link, and they may not be in tune on how to endorse policies or properly steward policies and champion those from the top, so that the rest of the organization takes them seriously. When we talk about partners, these could be hardware and software vendors, especially as a lot of those get pushed to the cloud. those are sitting in data centers someplace else. So there's some sort of business relationship here, and that's more and more happening with IT hardware and software, where it's not in a company-owned data center on-premise, but someplace else. And you're also dependent upon, software vendors to supply patches, et cetera. And so those can be agents as well, and also contractors. If you have external business partners that you have hired to augment your IT staff, those folks can be partners. Also, when you think about contractors, don't limit it to just IT staff, but take Milliken, for instance. We have business partners with Aramark to provide facilities and dining. We almost consider them to be internal agents, but technically they would be classified as partners. Threat actions, these are nothing new. We've gone over these different types of actions several times already in class. I think we have a good idea of how those fit into each category, all the different types. Again, can be both physical and non-physical intrusion. One piece we haven't talked about a lot are errors. So also consider threats to be employees, partners who have misconfigured software or hardware that create a vulnerability. And that could be knowingly or unknowingly. It could be improper training. It could also be negligence. Okay. Environment, enough can't be said about protecting your physical environment with, backup power generators, making sure you have a hot site if there's a natural occurrence, such as tornado, fire, flood, where your data center can keep on ticking if equipment goes down for one of those reasons. So we've talked about vulnerabilities before as well, and defined those weaknesses that we have in our systems. Those have a specific relationship to a threat that could thereby be exploited. And if we take a look at this risk map that maps magnitude over the frequency of occurrence, we can see that those that have a huge magnitude and happen all the time is incredibly unacceptable, or just somewhat unacceptable. And then we can see where those things that have a very small impact or hardly ever happen, those might be acceptable risks or even opportunities that an organization might be willing to take. So I always like to think of accepting risk as being almost, I like to think about it in terms of insurance, right? So you can either assume the risk and play the odds and the probabilities that it's not going to happen, or the cost of damage is such that you can recover for it reasonably. You can move that risk or transfer that risk to someplace else. So that would be, in that case, you would make somebody else responsible, but people buy insurance. That's one way of transferring financial risk. You could also hire external folks to assess that risk for you, but it still transferring the risk does not absolve you from it. And then the other way is to make actions either through technical or non-technical controls that would mitigate the risk, such to lower the likelihood of that occurrence happening, or at such a state where you would be able to recover from it reasonably well. So if we take a look at a specific risk scenario, and there are those 5 pieces that are involved. Okay, so we've got the actor or the agent, whether that is internal, external, or a partner, what the threat type is, the event itself. So what has happened? Is it theft? Is it interruption of service? Is it disclosure of confidential information, inappropriate use? So what's the actual event? What's the verb that took place? Which asset or resource has been affected, or multiple assets or resources have been affected? Is it people? Is it structures? Is it process? Is it servers? Is it information, or is it some sort of software application? And then the timing. Is this a one-time occurrence? Was it critical? Was it non-critical? what was the duration of the risk scenario? How was it detected, or was it detected at all, or what detection mechanisms are in place? And is there any type of time lag in which you wouldn't be able to detect maybe that risk or that event taking place? So here's a nice little flowchart map of how you can go through risk analysis in advance. So sometimes you'll discuss these as being tabletop scenarios or tabletop emergency response plans. So you identify let's say we've got an internal staff member who has created an error in the code that they've written that has caused modification of data accidentally, right? So not by malicious, but we've got a code error that a developer made against some software that's used internally, and it corrupts data, right? Or it modifies it inappropriately. And it took place over the last 48 hours, and it was undetected when the code got pushed to production, right? So you may go through this risk analysis and say, all right, well, this could happen. How often is this going to happen? What's the risk? And what's our level of risk tolerance, right? Is this something that we can handle? Is it something that's not tolerable at all? Or is it something that if it happens, we can respond later and fix the problem? Or is it something we need to mitigate the risk, put controls in place, transfer the risk someplace else, right? Or just own the risk, right? So, and you can build in these options such as avoid, transfer risk, reduce, mitigate, accept the risk. What's your response going to be? And how does that affect the organization, and running through different business case scenarios in relationship to that. So what you would then do is, for that particular risk then, or that event, so especially if we take something that might happen on a common basis, let's say maybe it's a denial of service attack, right, against your servers. So you would then start saying, okay, well, let's do some planning and some preparation as a first step. Let's make sure we have the right tools, we have the right R&D to detect it properly. We've got a communication plan on how we're going to notify others and who needs notified. What policies and procedures should we put in place? What users need aware of this potential risk, and make sure that the organization can respond appropriately. So then you would detect, triage, and do some investigation. So under that scenario, how would you define that incident taking place? Who gets notified? When do they get notified? How does it get escalated? How do you prioritize those? Are there intrusion detection systems that need to be put in place, or prevention systems? Can you use existing tools like anti-malware to detect these things? Should you be paying attention to a global threat database like an NVD or something? And can you do some log analysis on what's taken place? At that point, once you've kind of detected, triage, done some investigation, then you'll need to start doing containment, right? So protect what you have in place, be able to perform some forensic analysis to figure out what's taken place, do backtracking, start looking through logs. If systems are affected, start implementing recovery procedures so you can keep the business operating. Disaster recovery plan if it's that bad, and then figure out what caused it, right? So not just the symptoms, but what's the root cause. After you're back up and running and the incident's taken place, then you need to do some sort of post-incident assessment, right? I always kind of like to call these postmortems, right? So just exactly what happened, what times, who's responsible, how well did staff perform in dealing with it, were things well documented? Do we need to go back up and shore some things up and add some more details? What could we do in the future to prevent this? And provide some sort of management related matrix, such as how long did it take you to discover it? How long did it take you to recover? What was the cost associated with that? Understanding the lessons learned, and then close out that issue and make sure your management and stakeholders are notified, which could include customers, especially if data was disclosed and those types of things. So you can walk through this type of incident management and response for every case that you work through when an incident is discovered. And so a helpful model as we think about threats and agents together and what actions are taken and how we apply a consistent framework each time something like this takes place.